We are going to start by making a full puff pastry made out of vegan butter. Let's get to it. So the first step to making any puff pastry is to get your butter block in place. The butter insert or the butter block can be identified by both names if you choose, are 2 sticks of butter that have been cut up and chilled and placed in parchment paper appropriately, so when you insert the butter into your dough and you laminate it, you will have an excellent slab of butter already made. You know, most of us don't have butter blocks that we can purchase at the store, so this is an easy way to do it at home. So grab 2 sticks of butter. I like the Country Crock plant butter. This is my favorite one to use. It's the most stable, and also vegan butters tend to be coagulated, different types of oil, so it's just better to have one of those brands that you trust, and this is the one that I trust. So the key to making the butter block is using frozen butter. Perhaps not as frozen as this one. This one was a little too frozen, but like I've demonstrated in my vegan croissant video, which I will leave linked here, what we're going to do is we're going to grab a knife and then cut each individual block of butter in half and then into 3 or 4 different components and shards. Basically, what you want to do is cut the butter up so they're thin slabs approximately the same size, so you can insert into a parchment paper slab and then roll out when it's a little bit less frozen and make it into a rectangular shape to insert into your dough. Ultimately, that is the goal. So again, I would recommend freezing your butter, but not having it as frozen as mine. Maybe have it frozen and let it sit on the counter for like 10 to 20 minutes because it made it extra difficult to chop up. But have a nice sharp knife and then chop it up. In the case, like you fall into mine, that your butter is slightly too cold and you get these shards, do not worry whatsoever, because what you're gonna do when you get your parchment paper is that you're gonna take your parchment paper and then form all of the butter into a rough rectangle, approximately, let's say like a 10 by 4, yeah, that seems about closer an approximation, rectangle within the butter as the butter insert. Again, these are just approximations because I hardly ever really measure things out and it still works pretty damn well. So do as I say and find your own groove. Cooking is all about the feel. That's at least what I think it is. So put all the butter into that parchment paper and let it chill, or if you're already at the level of butter where you can easily roll it out, once you form it into a rectangle with your parchment paper and close those edges, what you're going to do is take your rolling pin, any rolling pin works fine, French style, regular style, and roll out your butter so that every little crevice of that rectangular shape you've made out of the parchment paper has been filled with vegan butter. So this can take anywhere from like 5 to 10 minutes, depending on how cold your butter is, but you don't want it room temperature butter. This is not good because this will just seep out of the parchment paper. Make sure it's definitely pretty chilled. Once you're done, you'll have this perfect block of butter that will be easily inserted inside of the dough, and when you're done rolling it out and you've created your butter insert, just put that bad boy into the refrigerator or freezer. I recommend the freezer simply because vegan butter tends to be a bit more oily and doesn't stay as solid. So definitely freeze that butter when you've had a moment to do so. To create the dough is pretty straightforward, and I tried to use measurements that everyone can recognize and they're not super challenging to remember. We're going to start with 500 grams of all-purpose flour. You can also use a combination of bread flour and all-purpose flour. In addition to 5 grams of salt, I used iodized table salt, 2 tablespoons of vegan butter at room temperature, and juice from half a lemon. This is optional. I use this to prevent gluten from forming. You can also use apple cider vinegar. Make sure that any seeds you've dropped in there get taken out because that's a little unpleasant, and add a cup of water to form everything together. It's easiest to do this in a KitchenAid stand mixer with the dough hook appliance, but you can easily do this by hand, no problem. It's just easier to mix in the butter when you have a dough hook to do the work for you. It's going to be a little loose at the beginning, and feel free to add a tablespoon or 2 of water if it's too loose, and let it sit there for 5 to 10 minutes until you have a nice development of gluten. The dough should definitely come off the edges of the stand mixer bowl. Now the butter block is hanging in the corner, but we're not going to touch it just yet. The first thing we're going to do is take that dough and just give it a quick knead by hand. I am a huge advocate for kneading by hand after you've done it in the stand mixer, simply because you get a better understanding of the gluten that's formed in your dough. This will be a slightly tacky dough, but nowhere near as tacky as like a brioche or anything like that. It just has a little bit of butter, and it gives you an understanding of how much flour you want to reincorporate into the dough, not too much, so that it's nice and round and taut. I then want everyone to put the dough into the refrigerator because you can't use it right after you've done kneading it. After you've kneaded the dough, it needs a decent amount of rest. So we're going to let this hang out in the refrigerator. Now the lamination. This tricky bit took me about a year, 2 years to try and understand. I watched many hours of British baking show and of how people made these full puff pastry by themselves, and I thought to myself, how the hell am I going to make this vegan? And after some failed attempts with several different kinds of brands of butter that just would seep out of that flour like it was no one's business, I finally figured it out. Lightly flour any sort of surface that you prefer to work on, and get that dough out of the refrigerator in your handy dandy butter insert, since we will be applying it into our dough. Take your rolling pin, I love my French rolling pin, and roll out your dough into an 18-inch by 16-inch rectangle, more or less. Again, this is just depending on the space that you have, but you want the dough to be a rectangular shape, wide enough and long enough to incorporate that butter block that we created in the first step of this video. Don't make it too thin, and also make sure that your surface is nicely floured so your dough doesn't stick, because once you have it rolled out to a decent shape, you want to insert that butter block. So take it out of the parchment paper, insert that beautiful rectangle in the center of your rectangle. So you have 2 lips on the side that you will then use to enclose your butter block. So take the one on the right, on the left, on the top or on the bottom, and bring it towards the center so your butter insert is completely enclosed and the top edges are nicely sealed as well. Now give it a good flouring, just a little bit. You know, people say not to use too much flour with lamination, but I haven't really had an issue just using a moderate amount. And roll it out with your rolling pin so it's about double the size in length and about half the size, more or less, in addition to its regular size and width. You want to just get that butter all incorporated into the dough so that it's nice and long and becoming part of the dough itself, but still creating those layers. And the method I use to incorporate the butter is the book turn method, which is basically, once you've stretched your dough to the appropriate length and your desired length, you can cut the edges off of the top and bottom if you prefer this like perfect lamination, but I don't do that simply because I think it works just as well. You're going to take the bottom half and put it into the center of that long rectangle we've created, and then take the top half and meet it at the center as well, but not over the bottom lip, essentially creating like a book. And then you're going to take either the bottom half or the top half and fold it over the other half, and that will help create those laminated edges. Now, for a double book turn, if your dough is not too taut or too glutinous at this point where it won't stretch, you're going to do the same thing over again. You're going to take that rolling pin, roll it out, really nice and long, a little bit in width, and add those turns once more. After we've fiddled with our dough for a good 15 minutes here, the dough is in need of some good relaxation. So we're going to put this dough back into a plastic bag of choice and let it chill in the refrigerator for a minimum of 30 minutes, up to an hour, 2 hours, whenever you have time to add an additional stretch and fold and book turn. So the final step, and this is all I do, this is the final book turn. I do a double book turn once again twice. But it kind of sets one single time that you're there dealing with the dough. You're going to lightly flour it. Use your rolling pin to stretch it out nice and long and a little wide. Take those top and bottom sections, have them meet in the middle, apply a turn one over the other like a book, and do it once more. So we have so many layers, it'll be ridiculous. At this point, you'll want to have your puff pastry chill in the refrigerator or have it hang out in the freezer, and you can use it anytime. You can decide to roll it out and have it in these really thin sheets. All I do is defrost my puff pastry every time I'm going to use it, and I just use whatever I need for that specific recipe, and I roll it out to the desired thinness at that point. So this has been one of my most successful videos to create and also make for me personally. Let me know in the comments any other kinds of videos or pastry you want to see made vegan, and see you next Friday. Take care.